I want to turn it over to Mary McCord, who keynoted in the morning, but she is legal director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center and a visiting professor there. And she previously was acting assistant attorney general for national security at the Department of Justice. Mary?
Thanks so much again, Mike, and welcome to all the panelists. I want to quickly introduce people. We have 4 fantastic panelists and 45 minutes, so I don't want to spend a long time on introductions, but I do think it's important for all of the listeners and viewers to kind of see the broad and diverse perspectives that we bring to this discussion. So in alphabetical order, we have Jason Dempsey. He's a former Army officer. He's written extensively on civil-military relations, and he currently works with Summer at Millions of Conversations on the role that veterans can play in reinvigorating a shared sense of citizenship. We have Heather Hurlburt, who runs the New Models of Policy Change initiative at New America, researching and advising on constructive responses to polarization, including what global experience teaches us about building resilience. She's also served at the White House and the State Department and as congressional staff. We have Elizabeth Neumann, who recently served as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security, where she was a passionate advocate for growing the department's ability to respond to emerging threats like violent white supremacist extremism and malign foreign influence. And we have Dr. Kori, who leads the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute and is the author of Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony. Kori has also served in the State and Defense Departments and at the White House. All right, so to kick us off, I'm going to direct a separate question to each of you based on what I hope to be your areas of expertise and particular interest in this broad topic that we have today. Given what we've seen in 2020 between protests over pandemic-related public health measures, demonstrations for racial justice, and against police brutality, I'd like to focus on what appears to be the increasing militarization of law enforcement domestically over this year and its impact on polarization. So I want to break my first question really into two pieces. One focused on the use of domestic law enforcement to quell protest activity, and one focused on US military entanglement in domestic law enforcement. So I want to start with you, Elizabeth. You were obviously at DHS until very recently. You saw, as the rest of us did, the federal government's aggressive use of law enforcement from across DHS and DOJ, my original home agency, against peaceful protesters in places like Lafayette Park, and to quell civil unrest in places like Portland, Oregon, and elsewhere. Do you think these deployments and the video footage that has gone viral about them has contributed to the growing ideological divide in America?
I absolutely think it has contributed. You know, part of the reason I started to speak out was because of what happened this summer and what a drastic departure it is from all of our principles, all of the, you know, I've been in the Homeland Security field since the department was stood up. Every single principle we have in the creation of the department is that it's based on partnership, with a strong view to the 10th Amendment, meaning police powers are held at the state and local level. And historically, DOJ has led that relationship with the law enforcement community, but DHS had this equipping role, this idea of, hey, in a new post 9/11 society, there are activities we need to ask emergency managers, law enforcement to undertake that they previously haven't been able to or haven't been asked to do and aren't equipped to do. So let's have conversations, we'll convene, we'll bring people together, we'll come up with best practices, we'll identify the gap, and then we'll fund equipping that gap. But the work itself was done by the state or by the locality. And the partnerships that were developed over the last 15 years were fairly robust. I'm not saying that there wasn't room for improvement, but there was an understanding and a respect that they had their role, we had ours at the federal level. something shifted in the Trump administration, and I think there are a couple of reasons for it. One, the overemphasis on immigration meant that leadership at DHS was not necessarily focused on the traditional DHS engagement with our local law enforcement partners. So I was getting phone calls from relationships that I had built during the Bush administration saying, why are you guys not talking to us about all of the other things that we normally talk about? So it was noticed by our partners that we had left the table, so to speak, and weren't having the kinds of dialogues that had occurred in the past. Instead, there was a lot of emphasis on sheriffs, which is great, but the Sheriff's Association was more open to those conversations on immigration. And it created a disconnect that I think allowed things like Portland to happen, meaning you had, especially by 2020, almost nobody with long-term Homeland Security expertise left in the department at a political level. So nobody able to provide advice or say, hey, that's not how we normally do things. So when you have this outside pressure from the president to get in there and do something, law and order, you had a lot of inexperienced people without relationships in the policing community and making bad calls, quite frankly. So I think part of what we saw this summer was directly attributed to a lack of connection with the policing community and understanding what the role of the department is. That said, the impact of those actions just drove a wedge. I mean, it caused me to, I was not planning on speaking out, it caused me to say, enough, you are ruining my country, right? And so it invoked outrage in me. So you had one side become outraged at what they saw the other side doing. So by definition, I became more polarized, right, in my viewpoints. And while I tried to explain that what was occurring was not necessarily representative of the 240,000 men and women that work for the Department of Homeland Security, and no, the proper response is not to defund and dismantle DHS, but clearly there are consequences when you do not have experienced leaders in some of these institutions that are supposed to protect not only our communities, but our rights. So I absolutely think that the actions that happened over the summer have increased polarization. And on the other side, I came from the Republican Party. I do not consider myself a Republican anymore, but the rhetoric and the echo chambers that we are currently living in allowed for the side that was supporting the president to justify why it was right to have these types of blatantly, in my view, unconstitutional actions. And since they never heard another alternative viewpoint, like, hey, by the way, like this whole federal agents infringing on the state of Oregon's territory, like that conversation never seemed to be happening in those circles. And they instead were very focused on Antifa. It was another reason I chose to speak out, because I felt like it was the truth about where the preponderance of our threats were coming from was being drowned out by the president's tweets. So trying to insert facts into the conversation, not saying that we don't have a challenge with certain anti-fascist groups, but the preponderance of our violence is coming from this right-wing extremist group. But I continue, when I look at it through that government lens, to struggle with how do we break through the echo chamber, because we are operating from two different set of facts. And I always want to clarify, I'm not suggesting that both facts are actually facts. It's just that the views of those that hold those facts are they have truth and the other side does not. So when we're operating that way, it becomes really hard for anybody in government to de-radicalize, right? And it's not, that's probably a different topic. I personally don't think the government can help the de-radicalization problem. And that's why in a lot of our work at DHS, we've moved to this prevention model that is empowering civil society to try to address the increased radicalization challenges.
We're going to come back to a radicalization question toward the end, hopefully, if we have time. But, that was a good focus on how the federal government, pulled in federal officials who don't normally do, on-street quelling of civil protests, pulled in people from the border in a really militaristic show of force. And as you indicated, sending a message that like that's what's required here, as opposed to your ordinary state and local police. But more, you know, in addition to that, and I want to direct this question to you, Kori, let's talk about Lafayette Square in particular this summer, because, you know, there we saw the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense pose with the president for a photo opportunity in front of St. John's Church, talking about a viral video, just after the clearing of the area of peaceful protesters using tear gas, using flash grenades, using rubber bullets, extremely heavy-handed tactics against, by all accounts, and by the videos, were peaceful protesters. So, you know, with your background in civil military affairs, I guess I'd like to understand, you know, how you view that, not just that photo op, but then the president's threats to invoke the Insurrection Act, in this entanglement of the military in domestic affairs. How does that impact how, you know, how we view ourselves, how we view our neighbors, how our own country is responding to this?
Such an important question, Mary. I think actually that the disgraceful behavior of General Milley in participating in the highly politicized White House orchestration of the Lafayette Square stuff may turn out, actually, in fact, I think we are already experiencing the longer term beneficial consequence of that, because what you saw after Lafayette Square, we need to distinguish between the behavior of the Secretary of Defense, who after all is a cabinet appointee and a politician by definition, and the behavior of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who has no business allowing himself to be put in that situation. And frankly, 3 years into a Trump administration, ought to have known better than to allow himself to be manipulated into that circumstance. But General Milley's deeply admirable correction of his mistake, the apology, the abject apology that he videotaped, actually served to reinforce the importance of the American military staying out of domestic policing, and I think served to have the American military leadership be concerned about doing damage to their compact with the American people by allowing themselves to be put in a position where they look supportive of partisan political activity. And I think the military leadership did a lot of good work with the other part of civilian control of the military, namely the Congress, between July and now, to make sure that they were shielded from being used as a partisan tool as the president disgracefully tried to delegitimize the electoral process. So Lafayette Square was bad, but I actually think in the medium and longer term, it's really served to reinforce the civil military, the subordination of the American military to proper civilian control, which is both the Congress and the executive branch, and also to clarify that they have no business being involved in domestic politics unless requested by a mayor, a governor, or under very limited circumstances that the protests last summer in no way approached meeting the federal government.
Thanks for that. And I think, you know, for our listeners, that last reference is really to the fact that, you know, the president did at various times at least mention invoking the Insurrection Act. So normally there is a criminal statute that bars active duty military for being involved in domestic law enforcement, and that's the Posse Coma Act. The exception to that is invocation of the Insurrection Act under, as you mentioned, very circumscribed situations where there is rebellion or insurrection and the inability of domestic law enforcement to control and enforce federal and state law. And of course, we didn't see anything, as you just indicated, like that this summer. So Heather, I want to turn to you now, because based on your sort of global experience, why should we worry about the militarization of domestic law enforcement? Like, what can we learn from the global experience here?
Thanks so much for asking that. And I actually want to pick up on what Elizabeth said, because your experience, and also Kori, to a lesser extent yours, are kind of a textbook case of what the international experience tells us the problem is here. And when you have the kind of deep-seated and violent division that we're seeing right now, we're really dependent on a couple of things. We're dependent on national institutions functioning as genuinely national institutions that all members of different polarized groups trust and see as serving their interests, at least minimally. And obviously, the institutions that deploy force are the most critical of those. But second, we're also really dependent on leaders of each group being able to speak to their own group members about what norms are. And, you know, we traditionally, and we still see military and law enforcement figures as leaders, both on a national level and within communities. So when we get to the kind of moment that Elizabeth is describing, where someone who's got as much experience in Homeland Security as she has can't make her voice heard, can't de-radicalize your colleagues, then, you know, we've really reached a moment that you see, I mean, and in very dire situations in other experiences globally on the path to violence, the moment where the technical term is in-group moderates actually start being shouted down, and their voices are no longer heard, or indeed they become at very grave personal risk, as we've seen, as was commented on in the previous panel, happening to election officials. So those are important factors. But for law enforcement and the military in particular, we have to face up to some of these divisions aren't new. And Elizabeth, something else you said that is very important is the role that immigration played on top of the racial divisions that were cited in the previous panel in fracturing American public opinion. And frankly, I think some deliberate efforts that were taken exactly because, Kori, as you said, the US military was perceived as having a very strong and successful desire to stay out of American politics. And so that led, I think, to a temptation to try to use other law enforcement forces to do things that the US military successfully resisted pressure to do. So now you have a situation where some groups of Americans see some law enforcement forces as not legitimate, not applying to them. And that Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Sri Lanka, that is the road to catastrophe and violent conflict. So if the situation with issue polarization is less severe than we often see in the media, the situation with polarization around military and security services is more severe, I think, than we often perceive it as, exactly because if we don't have agreement on what security is and who it's for, then the most fundamental purpose of government is lost, and our agreement on it as a people is lost. And, you know, I hope we can come back later to some more optimistic things about how we work about that. But you asked me why this is important, and, you know, this is all the marbles.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about, you know, domestic law enforcement, military, and I want to turn to you, Jason, because and I don't know if you were able to tune in this morning early when I spoke, but one of the things I spoke about was this increased public-facing engagement between unlawful private militias, unlawful private paramilitary organizations, and the public, whether they are in opposition to the government, such as their opposition to pandemic-related public health safety measures, or in supposed augmentation of legitimate law enforcement in protecting public safety, including in places like Portland and other where they will say they need to come out in force to protect property and to augment police and augment other law enforcement. One of the troublesome trends I've seen in my work with respect to these groups is how so many former military veterans and former law enforcement have been attracted to some of these unlawful militia groups and even to further extremist movements. And I wonder, given your experience, if you could speak to that a little bit, what that attraction is and you know, what you think we can do potentially to push back against that.
Yes, thank you, Mary. And I appreciate all the work you've done on this. You know, it's really hard to fight against the legitimizing aspect of, you know, the term militias. And, you know, for those of us who listen to you speak, right, we're very careful about putting unlawful militias in front of their name. And I think that's a key point that everybody needs to take with them, because what we've seen is Jessica Dawson recently wrote a great article on how the NRA over the last 30 years kind of co-opted ideals of patriotism into basically modern culture wars. And so there's been this, and really, you really have to, I mean, you have to take an incredible leap, but it's been done to be able to fly a "Don't Tread on Me" flag next to that desecrated American flag that has a blue stripe and black and white on it, right? That otherwise stands for Blue Lives Matter. I mean, what a conundrum you have to overcome to talk about, here's the power of the state, but I don't trust the state. I'm willing to back the power of the state, but I'm also against it. And what these militia movements have done, what the gun rights or ostensibly gun rights organizations have done, is they've fused all this messaging into a very powerful culture war. And without getting too deeply, I guess, into speculating on the psychology, I would say that as our collapse, or the collapse of our confidence in our nation, and that, you know, goes from all of our institutions, with the exception of the military, right? As we no longer believe that Congress can solve our problems or help us solve problems, or that the courts are on our side, or that businesses are looking out for our interest, or that we can even trust the church, we turn to this fetishized view of the military. It's not a realistic view of the military. It's a fetishized view of the military that, in a sense, it can solve problems, complex problems, simply through the use of force and technology and tribalism. So I know that doesn't directly get at, but your question of why military members join, but I think the 25% estimated members of militias who join, who come from previous military experience, they're bringing kind of the misguided view of why they walked in to the military too. And they're just looking for a sense of purpose. And I could spend all day long describing to you, hey, there's so much nuance. You need to get involved in your local politics. This is how you get engaged in your government. This is where you have to compromise. That's tough. But if I can tell you, hey, we're fighting zombies, put on your kit and grab your weapon because the enemy's over there, that's an easy thing to get behind. And it's something that people can feel motivated about, they can feel powerful about, and they can overcome their sense of loss or inability to engage the body politic.
That's very consistent with everything I've seen as well, including some of my own conversations with some of the leaders of some of the unlawful militia groups who were former military, who seemed to continue to have a desire for having a mission, right? Anybody who's been in the military, frankly, anybody who's spent very much time in the government has that sense of mission. And when you give it up, sometimes there's a void there and a loss there. And I think we'd also be remiss not to talk, and I'd like to come back for one more thought from you on this, Jason, about mental health and the impact of some of the mental health challenges that our military veterans have experienced when they've come back from literal battlefields abroad into the US, and whether you think, you know, mental health is becoming more of discussion topic, of course, in this country. I think it's also a challenge for our law enforcement, and they've had quite a year themselves. And I think, you know, I've read data about suicide rates and et cetera being up among law enforcement. So I just would be interested in your comments or your thoughts, Jason, on, you know, the mental health impacts or aspects of this phenomenon that we're seeing.
I think there's two dimensions, and it's partly how we define mental health. And I think there's a very narrow definition of mental health, which encompasses post-traumatic stress disorder, right? It's you know, legitimate, hardcore instability brought about by traumatic events. That is not the major driving factor, but it could be the match, right? Because if you have a group of 100 members of an unlawful militia hanging out, they all have weapons. They have to make a lot of decisions. What we saw in Kenosha was a ton of armed people on the street, and who failed to make the right decision? Well, of course, it's a 17-year-old boy, because he has no idea how the world works. And he's got some really screwed up ideas about how he might solve problems or what a gun means. So I don't think they're the driving factor, right? I think the bulk of what you'd see, so if there's 25% or so out of 15 to 20,000 militia members across the United States that are military, you're talking somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000. I would submit that the driving factor there is not mental health, but moral injury, in a very diffuse sense, in that here are people who really weren't sure of purpose in life. They were told, hey, if you go overseas and you fight the good fight, that America will be behind you, will take care of you, and your life will have meaning, and forever you'll be a hero. And that's not what they found overseas. They found much more nuanced, complex situations, no easy victories, and they probably weren't the Jason-born operator that they aspired to be when they joined the military. But now they come home with that disappointment, and they still feel a nagging need to fulfill that. And so I think that's where the bulk of this comes from. It's this idea that, man, local politics is hard, and I really don't want to argue over potholes and tax rates, but I can stand on the street carrying a gun and people will think I'm a patriot.
Well put. I want to throw something out there and hear all of your response to this. I want to talk about, and Elizabeth alluded to this, disinformation, right? The current disinformation about the results of the election. What's been, you know, there's been a long build up to this. The president, for months before the election, was talking about mail-in ballots being highly susceptible to voter fraud, was setting the stage for an argument that anything else, anything other than a clear win for him would be clearly the results of a rigged election and ballot fraud. And of course, now post-election, that refrain is continuing, and it's continuing through the mostly baseless litigation that's being filed, the pressure being put on poll workers and election officials, as we just were discussing, and the stoking of the Stop the Steal rallies that we're seeing across the country. And what's been really amazing to me about these rallies is they have been bringing together such a broad coalition of people. So from people who legitimately are vulnerable to the disinformation, either because of the media that they consume, which is buying into it and promoting that disinformation, or because of their social media circles or their friend circles, their television news, that are vulnerable to that, and who honestly believe that there is voter fraud out there, even though there's been, Republicans and Democrats have both said there's no state officials, there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. They're buying into that narrative as well. But they are going to the same rallies as conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones of InfoWars and like others who support the QAnon conspiracy theories. They're going to the same rallies as unlawful armed militias are going to, who are openly talking about things like civil war, things like, and I'm not going to name the names of these organizations. I've decided to quit doing that because they crave the attention, and they monetize it and merchandise it and recruit on it immediately. We know that after the president's first debate. They crave that attention, but they're going to the same rallies and uniting. So this tent that used to be sort of far-right extremist has gotten a lot broader. To me, as a former counterterrorism official, that's a radicalization process. And so I'd like to hear each of you speak to that, because each of you has been involved at various times in counterterrorism efforts. I know from your times in the White House and in federal government and in the military. And how do we address this type going forward, this apparent radicalization of such a large segment of the population? And let's just start, we'll just go back in the order we went before. We'll start with you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for bringing this up. This is like the thing that I lie awake at night wondering about, and I look forward to others' solutions because I feel like I'm just going to offer more insight to the problem. So I left DHS in April of 2020. So before I left, the pandemic had started, and knowing what some of the public health measures were going to be, because we've been talking about it internally, I oversaw the team that we had created that originally was labeled Countering Violent Extremism. We've kind of migrated the term to be Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, and asked that team to go do research based on everything we know. Are we likely to see more violence? And they came back and said yes. And they gave multiple reasons why. Research of people that have conducted attacks, they have common factors in their background. And just because you have these common factors does not mean you're going to go commit an attack. But things like significant life change, loss of job, loss of loved ones, feelings of instability in your life. Well, we're all feeling all of those things right now. So you've just, for the entirety of the country, created vulnerability for any number of people who also may have other things in their background, as Jason was alluding to, that makes them predisposed to being vulnerable. So we just increased the stress factors, increased risk factors for the entirety of the country. Then you add on top of it, we were starting to see what you would expect out of anti-government or libertarian sentiments, that who are you, government, to tell me how to live my life? Who are you to tell me I have to stay home? I have to wear a mask. And so we wrote a series of recommendations in March that sadly were not adopted or even heeded. But it basically was, it is really important very early on to have a clear and consistent message and explain to the average American. You're not trying to change the viewpoints of somebody on a fringe, but explain to the average American what the laws are and why the government does have the right in emergencies to be able to carry out certain activities, like say you need to stay home or wear a mask. And none of that occurred, of course. And in fact, the worst case scenario occurred. You had the media fill a void, and because it was the mainstream media, for those on the right, they already don't trust them. And then you had the president come in and kind of create an alternative set of facts. And so I was routinely talking to family members that would traditionally be considered on the right. And they were telling me in March, even into April, this virus is a hoax. I'm sure many people saw, there was a really stunning interview with a nurse in South Dakota this last week, where she was holding patients' hands as they're dying, and they are telling her, I'm not dying of coronavirus, I'm dying of lung cancer. So the things that started last March have now perpetuated and further created this divide, and it was predictable. And I know all of the folks on this screen, we all probably had a similar reaction of like, oh no, this is about to get worse. So we weren't necessarily expecting the riots that we saw. Of course, didn't predict George Floyd's death and the outrage associated with that. And in some ways, we kind of thought that might have been a pressure release valve, because you had so much built up tension. It gave people a way to feel connection in a common cause. But that also created that opportunity for the other side, who were looking for a group of people together to commit those attacks. And that's what we saw from a well-known group. I'll follow your lead, Mary and not mention them, who conducted those accelerated attacks. So for us, what we were observing and challenged with is we already had a tense environment because of the two echo chambers. It was an election year. It was already bound to be tense. You add the pandemic on top of it. It really has driven a wedge and affected people at a stress level that I think we often forget when we're listening to people yell at each other about masks and stuff. But there's a deeply it deeply affects certain people, and for it's almost a traumatic or a triggered type of reaction. And so all of that stew that we're operating in leads us to our present moment, and how you get past that. I can only use my personal experience. Talking in mass media form or on social media doesn't seem to have that much of effect at this point. But when you get to very small communities or groups, and in the context of you're getting together for a gathering and you're laying out the rules by which you all agree that you're going to operate. We're going to wear masks. We're going to stay 6 feet distant. I mean, that some of the conversations I've had to have over the last few months, it's required patience and listening and sharing perspectives and say, okay, we're going to agree to disagree, but I still love you. I still want to be in relationship with you. And so can we do it this way? But that's painful and exhausting. And it's kind of, I'll say that is the process of getting us past the yelling at each other, is that you have to enter those painful conversations. So when I look to what can government do as to the present state, it will be extremely helpful to have a leader that is not stirring the pot the way that we currently have a leader. I think things changed dramatically in February and March when the president is not on the front page every single day. And people, quite frankly, I think are tired, and I think we'll just start to move into some normalization. But there will still be a fairly large group of people in our country that are radicalized. And there is a monetization of outrage on both sides, but in particular, the conservative infotainment sector makes money off of that outrage. And so for me personally, I am wrestling with, how do I help people that have, unbeknownst to them, they become radicalized in their thought. They hold views that they didn't hold 10 years ago because all they listen to is that conservative infotainment. I have argued that unless we help them break the deception, we cannot operate with 30% of the country holding the extreme views that they do. And so I've been encouraged by some of the other speakers today that maybe we're not as far apart as we seem to be. That's very encouraging. Maybe it's not a hard of a journey, but breaking through that echo chamber is, I think, very critical, or we will see more violence, especially when we start returning to normal life and you have mass gatherings. It will be very devastating, considering all of the fertile ground that has been laid in the last year.
So helpful, Elizabeth, really appreciate, helpful enough, we do need to turn, we try to turn upbeat here, right? But there's a lot that's just very, very troublesome right now about where we're at. Kori, thoughts on those questions or anything that Elizabeth has raised?
Elizabeth makes a plausible case for how people have been radicalized. I think 3 solutions, again, none of them easy, but 2 of the 3 already in motion. The first is, as Elizabeth said, leadership really matters. It really matters that the President of the United States is an arsonist of radicalization. And it will really help when that's no longer the case. The second is regulation of social media. Congress and the administrative state need to get smart, excuse me, about the way that amplification of information is occurring on social media, and either help social media CEOs and boards to become more responsible about the damage they're doing to American society, or regulate better practices. And the third, and this is the hardest one, is that there's actually no substitute for an educated public. As Horace Mann, the founder of the American public school system, said, education is our only political safety. Outside of that arc, all is deluge. And we begin to be smarter consumers about information, but it's actually going to take a ton of work. It's going to take the equivalent of Schoolhouse Rock, public service announcements, and trusted mediators, and pastors and rabbis and imams helping all of us be better citizens.
Couldn't agree more. You need everybody, right? It takes everyone at every level, including our leadership, which is about to change. Heather, your thoughts?
So distressingly, a number of years ago, when most of us on the screen were primarily worried about international terrorism, there was a finding that perversely, the more Americans reported being educated about Islam and Muslims, the more prejudiced and hostile attitudes they tended to hold, which is a really distressing reflection that just education by itself doesn't solve a problem. It's the question there is, can we get to a place where we can have some kind of national stand? I mean, if you Schoolhouse Rock, the example you gave, you couldn't do Schoolhouse Rock in the polarized environment in which we now are, I think, and that's an enormous challenge. So I also find it, from an international perspective, very troubling to think about how, again, those of us who were in government as far back as the Rwandan genocide looked at the way information bubbles were created for rural farm dwellers and said smugly to ourselves, we are Americans, and we could never be that isolated. But I think you have to ask yourself whether we have now created epistemic closed communities that are every bit as impoverished as what we imagine the lives of rural Rwandans to have been. And so there, in order not to just be relentlessly negative, a couple of things that will help. And one is getting back to this point of supporting the in-group moderates. And really, this is going to have to start, I think, at the local level. Removing the arsonist in chief is important, but increasingly who people think are authority figures is both more extreme figures and more local figures. And so and particularly because it just bears saying this isn't we don't have parallel polarizations on the right and left. And so we have this particular challenge on the right of figuring out how to empower. And, so those of us who are clearly identified as not on the right, like me, are particularly ill-equipped to do this work. But really helping folks who are trying to stand up for norms in their communities do so. And this, brings to the question of this panel, what is the role of law enforcement and the military? And there's obviously a couple vital roles, but really one of the roles is to figure out how to make sure we stay out of the way and allow for community conversations and allow for trust building at the local level. And I think in a way that's going to be a particular challenge as national institutions become identified with a democratic president. How do we make it possible for law enforcement at the local level to both rebuild trust with communities of color and rebuild trust with conservative communities? And that's an enormous challenge, which is going to take a lot of resources that don't necessarily flow from the center out and aren't amenable to the kind of let's lock them all up problem solving that we're going to be tempted to use because those are the tools that are easily available to us.
Great comments. And I wish we had more time to talk about this movement of constitutional sheriffs, because we talk about the local level and the need for reform, and this idea that there's a body of sheriffs out there that say, we don't really answer to governmental authority, we answer to the Constitution. Of course, it's the Constitution as they see it, which may or may not have any basis in text history or Supreme Court precedent. But you're absolutely right. We've got to get to it from that point. Sorry, my phone's going off over here. Jason, bring us home with your thoughts on this question, please.
Yeah, for one, I think Heather, Elizabeth, and Kori, covered some of the fundamentals. One, it's the local news element to it, where we get our news from, and the idea of how the tech conglomerates have kind of figured out that radicalization is the quickest way to profit. And so how do we overcome that? And you combine that quick path to profit with our arsonist politicians, and you get some really weird things. Obviously, you get where we are, but you also get Americans who define themselves, who otherwise are really kind of chaotic in their views, but now all of a sudden they believe in Trump or they're anti-Trump. And we forget that Obama-Trump voters exist, right? And we forget that there is much more complexity to the way the American voter approaches politics. And it doesn't fall necessarily directly in line with elite views, but the technology of today and the way our media is shaped allows opportunistic elites to highlight the most pressing or seemingly moral battles as a way to collect and motivate folks who otherwise might not line up behind each other, at least not in a way that they feel like throwing out, our form of government to get their way. And that obviously ties into education. I would say Americans, and I blame, my parents' generation, we're not guilt-free, but the baby boomers particularly forgot the lessons of their parents. And they forgot why we built so many institutions to keep ourselves in check and to force compromise. And we realized that compromise was not the worst thing on earth. Actually, unleashed warfare is actually a lot worse than compromise. Getting along with your neighbor, it's tough, but it's a heck of a lot easier than civil war. So we've got to work through those things. And I know the three other speakers, they all talked about that. What I would close with from my comments is, it's how we're using the military, because there's both an opportunity and a danger in how we use the military, and particularly in an era when military service is exceptionally fetishized. We are prone to taking a lot of the wrong lessons for it. On the one hand, we want military service to be about, hey, here's recognition of people, Americans who are serving a common ideal and are working for the greater good. But with that comes a recognition that the military doesn't solve all problems. It certainly couldn't solve all our problems overseas. It sure as hell can't solve all of our problems domestically. And we have to be mature enough to recognize there are no easy answers, even if they're carrying a gun and wearing body armor. We've got to get past that and be wary of the idea of militarism that doesn't lead to a common conception of service, but leads to the kind of tribalism where we have to protect ourselves and our family by force against those we disagree with.
Thanks, Jason. And thanks to all of the panelists. It's really been a tremendous conversation. I could continue this for several more hours. There's so many things I'd like to talk with each of you about, but I'm going to hand things back to Mike, to tell us what we do next. Thank you.